Hey everybody, it is Natalie from Power Moon Tarot, and tonight I have a special treat for you. We're going to be going over the astrology of Alexander II, Czar of Russia, and this was a subscriber request, and that I work on more historical figures for you guys, and that was something I wanted to do. As I had left you guys that community post about, not just doing the chart of celebrities, but also historical figures. And so tonight this is actually the first stab that I've ever taken at doing anything related to Russian history. So I'm definitely not a Russian history expert. So please do allow me that, that grace as I go through this video. And let me just make sure that our webcast is up and running. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. And if you want to spend your Saturday night with me talking about Russian history, here we are and here we go. So we are going to go ahead and get into it. And I picked Alexander II because he has an accurate birth time. Alexander II was the Czar of Russia, or the Emperor of Russia, from the time period of 1855 to 1881. And he was, Czar of Russia during a very interesting time in Russian history, when Russia found out that it was in bad need of reform, and it was needed to become more modern along with the rest of the world. And so we'll talk about, as he came to power and as he came to reign, what was happening at that time. And it's interesting because I will draw in some parallels with Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln was also president of the United States at that time, and the Civil War was going on in the United States at that time. And in history, historians have oftentimes drawn distinctions or similarities between Alexander II of Russia and Abraham Lincoln, because both managed to basically put the laws into effect during their rulership of freeing the slaves. As we know, Abraham Lincoln supported the freeing of the slaves and, did the Emancipation Proclamation. And Alexander II was responsible for freeing 23 million serfs, which were essentially slaves at that time in Russian history. And so we will talk about that, and that's why Alexander II is oftentimes called the Liberator Czar. And on this screen, you can see right now a picture of him and what he looked like. And then right underneath here, I actually have the symbol for the sun in astrology. I also have the symbol for Rahu, or the North Node. Now, Alexander II has a Sun-Rahu conjunction and was born on an eclipse, and we will talk about that. And he also has many planets in Taurus. So you see the little glyph for Taurus there with the king, with the king's crown on top of it. Anyway, so he has a Sun-Rahu conjunction in Taurus, which we will talk a lot about during this reading, and the fact that he was born on an eclipse. Now, Alexander also suffered, 7 assassination attempts on his life, and he ended up dying in a bombing. And just as Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Alexander II was also assassinated too, which is another common thing that these two have in common with each other. And so with that being said, I am going to go ahead and show the chart. Thank you for being here with me. And if you're watching the video, you can say hi in the chat if you feel like it, and talk with me as I'm going through it. I really do appreciate it. And welcome to our Saturday night of Russian history, everybody. We all know we're old when ... This is what we are doing on Saturday night. But let's go ahead, and I want to, just read you a teeny bit here from the Encyclopedia Britannica about Alexander II. Here's his Wikipedia page talking about his reign. And the main thing he was known for, which was the emancipation of 23 million serfs or slaves. And Alexander II succeeded the throne upon the death of his father. He had been an enthusiastic supporter of his father's reactionary policies. He always obeyed his father's rules, but now he was the ruler and was going to rule according to what he thought he knew best. Okay. And he ended up, emancipation was not a simple goal to be achieved instantaneously. Like the emancipation of all the slaves in Russia had a major impact on their economy. And it wasn't just the emancipation of the slaves that Alexander did. He brought about a ton of reforms, which were considered very radical at the time. Like radical reforms when it came to like media, press, like being more free, when it came to reforming the military, when it came to reforming education. Like it definitely, for a long time, not a long time, but for a short time, it looked like Russia may start moving in a more like liberal kind of a direction. But unfortunately, Alexander had multiple attempts on his life by people who wanted to assassinate him. And that kind of, the fear of that and everything kind of made him become more conservative towards the end of his life. And we'll talk more about that. I'm actually going to be going over his assassination attempts with you near the end. And he died March 13th, 1881. He was the emperor of Russia. His liberal education and distress at the outcome of the Crimean War, which had demonstrated Russia's backwardness, inspired him towards great domestic reforms, the most important being the emancipation of the slaves in Russia, and then a period of repression after 1866 led to revolutionary terrorism and his own eventual assassination. So he ruled during a time of a lot of ups and downs and changes that were going on. Now, let me go ahead. I'm going to turn on my annotator here for the screen. And we can see here that Alexander is a Leo rising. And as I mentioned earlier, he does have a Sun-Rahu conjunction. That's the North Node right there. Sun-North Node conjunction at 8 degrees Taurus. And so Alexander, now the moon is at 29 degrees Aquarius, which, talk about, wanting to free the people, wanting to free the slaves. We know those humanitarian ideals that are often associated with Aquarius as far as like the modern man and humanitarian ideals. Now, one thing I want to point out here too about Alexander's chart is he was born on an eclipse. Now, it may not look like it yet because the moon hasn't reached the sun, but Alexander was actually born in between two eclipses because he was born on April 29th. And on April 21st, there was a partial lunar eclipse in Scorpio. And then on May 5th, there was a new moon solar eclipse at 14 degrees Taurus, which was about 6 degrees off from his sun. So he was literally born in the eclipse zone in between two eclipses. And that does make him an eclipse baby. And there are many like royals that are born on eclipses. And oftentimes like eclipses are associated with the death of leaders as well. Because as we know, when there's an eclipse and the North Node is eclipsing the sun is the king and the ruler. But when Rahu or the North Node moves to cover up that sun, it's eclipsing that leader or cutting off that leader. And oftentimes eclipses were known as like king killers, basically. And so we'll talk about the role of eclipses in Alexander's life and how eclipses played out for him, because people who are born on eclipses often, during their lifetimes, eclipses are even more so maybe a bigger deal for them as far as big crises and big events going on. And mouse pajamas. Oh, mouse pajamas. Yes, this was for you. Thank you for doing this. I clicked so fast. I don't know about the Sun-Rahu conjunction. I don't know about the Sun-Rahu conjunction. I have that too. Oh, do you have a Sun-Rahu conjunction in your chart? Okay. All right. And now we want to see if the moon is close to Ketu or the moon is close to the sun. And that moon is about ready to join the sun in a couple days there, because that moon moves really quick. So that's how I can tell. He was basically born right in between a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse. And so that is pretty cool as far as, he is a major world leader at that time, born on a eclipse. And oh, mouse pajamas, you have Venus too. Yeah, so Venus in his chart is too far to really be a conjunction with the sun, but the Venus in Taurus is very strong, and it is there too. And so we will talk about that Venus in Taurus. And let's talk a little bit about his chart in general, just kind of. So we know he's born right in between a lunar and a solar eclipse, so he is an eclipse baby. A couple interesting things about his chart. He was also born one day before Jupiter went retrograde in Capricorn, okay? So Jupiter went retrograde in Capricorn on April 30th. He was born on April 29th. So he was born essentially on a Jupiter station. Now, because he has, this is a little complicated, but because he has a day chart, Sun in Taurus at the top of his chart here, because he was born at 10 a.m., he has a day chart. Now, that means Jupiter is going to be the most positive planet in the chart. Mars is going to be the most negative planet in the chart. And they are actually opposing one another. We have a Mars-Jupiter opposition. And we have Jupiter in Mars's exaltation sign, and we have Mars in Jupiter's exaltation sign. So we have a mutual reception between Mars and Jupiter, and they are opposing each other. Now, we're going to talk about this Mars-Jupiter because when you're talking about, now I mentioned earlier in the webcast how Alexander II was many people tried to assassinate him many times. And, secret assassinations, Mars in the 12th house, definitely, but opposing Jupiter and exchanging signs with that Jupiter and mutual reception, he managed to avoid assassination for years and years and years, on end until it finally got him. So we're going to talk a lot about that Mars-Jupiter opposition and how even though Mars is in its sign of fall and Jupiter is in its sign of fall, they are in mutual reception. And so it does kind of, you see some of the bad things that are going to happen and some of the good things that are happening to him. And oftentimes astrology is like that. It can be kind of a mixed bag. And so we've got that mutual. Now, when I started looking at his chart, I'm like, oh, this is a chart of mutual receptions. We've got mutual receptions all over the place. The Jupiter, we have Saturn here in Jupiter's sign, Saturn in Pisces. And then we have Jupiter in Saturn's sign in Capricorn, and they're making a sextile to each other. So we've got a mutual reception going on there between Jupiter and Saturn. And then also we have this moon in Aquarius here in a square to the Mercury in Taurus. And the moon is exalted in Taurus. And then Mercury does very well in Aquarius, even though, and some astrologers would say, that Aquarius is a domicile for Mercury. And so you could almost say there is a mutual reception there as well. So this chart has a lot of mutual receptions going on. And that is, a lot to take in when you're first looking at the chart. And so if you're like, I don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. We will talk about it. Yeah, mouse pajamas. There were 7 attempts on his life, and the 7th one finally got him from what I was reading. And so it's really crazy how, and how scary that must have been to live your whole life like that, kind of watching over your shoulder like that. And, when I saw that he had, because the 8th house here in astrology has to do with our death, And when I saw the Saturn, Chiron, Pluto conjunction in the eighth house, I was like, ooh, that looks like a really tough death, or somebody who has a really bad, rotten type of a death. And he did indeed have a very ugly, brutal death. A bomb was thrown at his feet, and it, removed his legs, basically. And he did live through it. But anyway, you guys, I'll tell you more about that later, about what happened. But he did indeed, he had a very brutal death. When I saw that, I was like, yeah, that looks a little brutal on the death end there, as the eighth house is the house associated with death, and the Saturn, Pluto, Chiron. I thought, yeah, it looks like a hard death. So yeah, we've got some interesting planetary combinations going on here. We've got, like I said, the Mars-Jupiter opposition, exchanging signs and mutual reception. He's born on an eclipse. He has 2 planets at the anaretic degree, or at the critical degree. When we have planets in our chart at 29 degrees, it means those planets are in crisis. They are in the very last degree of that sign. And he has Mercury at the 29th degree in Taurus, and he has the moon at the 29th degree in Aquarius, and they're actually squaring each other. So that's another, kind of sign of the times of which Alexander was trying to lead the country during these very hyper change times in Russian history, but nobody was like, but people were resisting the change, and people were not ready for the change, but yet the change was being demanded from them. And when we think about his chart, now this is a concept that I explore a little bit, is oftentimes like the ruler of the country, or the president or the emperor or the king, whoever is the ruler of that country, their chart often exemplifies their birth chart. When they are the ruler of that country, their birth chart can really exemplify, I think, the good things and also the struggles that the country is going through that in that time. And what I'm saying is that the ruler of a country, their birth chart is like, you would say it's intertwined with that country, because they are the ruler of that country. So whatever is happening to that country is a direct impact from that ruler. So I think that that's an interesting concept. So when we're looking at this chart, we want to think about what was happening in Russia, and Alexander II being the person that was kind of this whole mess fell into his lap when he became emperor and his father passed away, and he inherited this very tension-filled time where we have these very old ideas, Mercury and Taurus, these very old kind of like entrenched ideas going against the moon in Aquarius, making a square to the moon in Aquarius about the hyper need for change, the hyper need for new technology, the hyper need for new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. But it's like, I'm struggling against the Mercury in Taurus. I'm struggling against the entrenched attitudes, the stubborn, fixed attitudes and thought patterns that are not changing. And if we look at Alexander's chart, he has a lot of fixed energy in his chart, which says, he's not one to give up, but it's also maybe hard for him to change. And I think it was at a time where he was making these changes in Russia, where Russia wasn't necessarily ready for it, but the changes were being demanded. And you can see he's a Leo rising. He has Sun in Taurus and Moon in Aquarius. So those are all fixed sign energies. And so we will talk about that as well. And how interesting it was that he was born. Now, this Jupiter in Capricorn, like I said, it's stationed retrograde one day after he was born. So he was born on a Jupiter station. So this Jupiter is going to be very pivotal for him in his life. And, as far as all the government reforms and all the reforms of the military and education and everything that he did, and then kind of it all kind of turning around and going back to more conservative agenda again is very much that Jupiter retrograde, I think. And we'll see this Jupiter playing a major part in his chart as we are going through it. Now, so I talked about, just kind of generally the chart. And I mentioned that he is responsible for reforms with communication, humanitarian progress, reducing class privilege, and increasing education in the military and the government. And there's a quote by Alexander II where he says, "It's better to liberate the peasants from above than to wait until they win it through uprisings from below." Okay, so that is very much like, I think that's very the Mercury moon square there in Aquarius and Taurus, in the sense that, we can, maybe not everyone is ready for this, and maybe society has these entrenched values, but, moon in Aquarius at the 29th degree, we can either wait and nothing ever changes and they rise up against us, or we can free the people now. And I mentioned earlier that Alexander II was oftentimes compared to Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln, at the same time all this was going on, we'll talk about it later, the Abraham Lincoln connection, but it really is kind of wild. And anyway, let me go ahead, and I need to find the beginning of my notes here. I want to go ahead now and get into some specifics about his chart. So here we have, like I mentioned, Alexander II is a Leo rising, okay? And because he's a Leo rising, the importance of the sun in his chart, as the sun is the ruler of his ascendant, sun is going to be very important in his chart. And of course, sun is very important in general when it comes to a ruler, because the sun is the supreme authority of the universe, and everything goes around the sun. And so when we're thinking of like leaders, and we're thinking of, leaders of countries and honor and dignity and royalty, that's all very much like Leo sun type of association. So he is a Leo rising. And what's interesting is Alexander was his father's firstborn son. And so he grew up knowing that he was going to be king. And, as the firstborn son, there's no, like I wrote down in my notes, no pressure or anything, right? Like if you're the firstborn son of a major leader, then you're obviously going to become the next leader. And he had known that his whole life. And, oh, Lisa, it's so good to see you. Lisa, hey there. And I was thinking about you the other day, and I'm like, man, I haven't seen Lisa on my lives recently. I wonder if she's still around. And so I'm glad you're here. Yay. We're doing Saturday Night Russian History. And so, yeah. Hey, everybody. Yeah. Yay, us. And so, it's interesting because the sun at 8 degrees Taurus is squaring his ascendant in Leo. Now, to me, the sun in the chart also represents, authority, government, father, okay? So the sun does associate with father, and it's like my father is up in my 10th house. And I'm a Leo rising, and I'm going to rule one day like my father. And I'm looking up to my father in my 10th house, and I'm going, wow, what a guy, what an important guy. And I want to be like my dad someday. And, kind of like looking up to dad, or I've got some big shoes to fill, or even feeling maybe small because he's in a square to the sun in Taurus representing father, like maybe feeling smaller compared to father. Like father is this big, great leader, and I'm just little old me, and I know I'm going to be that leader someday. And of course, if you're the firstborn son, it's like, hey, like I said, no pressure or anything, but you're going to be the leader someday of this entire country. And so we have that going on. Now, what is interesting is so what I was reading some comments about Alexander II's childhood and growing up with a father who clearly is like so visible and powerful and the leader of the nation and everything, is it said that early in his youth, Alexander was overshadowed and overpowered by the personality of his dominating father, who was a strict authoritarian. Now, when we use the words overshadowed, that is a very eclipse type of a thing. And I explained earlier how Alexander II was born 4 days after a total lunar eclipse in Scorpio, and about a week before a solar eclipse in Taurus. So he was born right in between two eclipses. So I mentioned how he's an eclipse baby. And also, when we have, so not only is he born on an eclipse, but, he's got the Sun-Rahu. The sun rules the first house of self. So he's looking up at his father like, whoa, that's my dad. But historians writing that he was overshadowed by the over-dominating personality of his father. Now, when we think of an eclipse, what happens, right? When the sun is eclipsed by the north node, what happens? The sun gets covered up and you don't see the sun anymore, right? So that whole kind of overshadowing thing, the comment that I was reading from historians was very interesting to me about his powerful, dominating father overshadowing him. Now, his father was somebody that very much clinged to the traditional Russian strict authoritarian vibes, and you can see that with that Taurus energy, with the sun in Taurus and the Rahu in Taurus, like very much like a father that is more entrenched in the like the fixed attitude of nothing is going to change, right? So he looks up at his father like, my father is a stable ruler, sun in Taurus. But because Rahu is there, I feel that maybe Alexander wasn't always seeing his father in the most like, I don't want to say truthful light, but in the most like reality of lights, because Rahu does obscure things and make it hard to understand things. So it's like I'm looking up at my father in my 10th house, and he's this great man and he never changes, and he's this solid leader, and he's not changing anything in Russia. He's very strict. He's he's repressive. He's authoritarian. He's all of that, but he doesn't change. And I'm looking up at him and I'm like, whoa, what a guy. But not even realizing like how different he is than his own father, his ascendant squaring the sun. He's very different than his own father. And when he takes office, his policies are way different than his father. And, oh, Lisa, you kept missing me. I'm so glad you made it. I thought maybe if I do one Saturday night, well, I'll catch like, I would consider myself like one of the older people in the world these days, like middle-aged people. I was like, maybe I'll catch some other people who are at home chilling, but anyway. So yeah, like it's interesting with the sun Rahu in the 10th house of my father and how I see my father, and Rahu kind of obscuring how he sees his father. And, let's think of another major world leader who has a sun Rahu conjunction. Drumming, anybody. What other world leader, modern world leader has sun Rahu conjunction? None other than Donald Trump. Right? And I did his chart before, and you can find it under my celebrity readings. But Donald Trump was also born on an eclipse and has a Sun Rahu conjunction, and his father had a huge impact on his life, but it wasn't probably the greatest in the grand scheme of things, given how he is. But anyway, so we see this whole, I have this important father figure that I'm idealizing, but I'm also like, not necessarily seeing them in the most accurate way because my sun is being eclipsed. My father is being eclipsed by Rahu. And I wrote down, with the sun square his ascendant, I feel small compared to the big presence of my father, who's a very important man. I want to be important like my father. I want my father to like me and see me as important too. And like I said, he was his father's firstborn and male heir to the throne. So again, no pressure, right? Like, well, I just got to rule during these, follow up to my father here. And then his father probably instilling the importance of ruling with an iron fist with the Sun-Rahu in Taurus, and sticking to what you know, not changing, staying the same, and producing a solidly stable lineage, which his father did produce a solidly stable lineage. Because back in the day, oftentimes, like, a lot of firstborn sons would die or pass away or have health things or issues, or they couldn't have kids. There was always a lot of things going on. But when we see with the Leo rising with Alexander II, Leo rising has a duty to defend and duty to rule. And, that conflicting energy with his father, with how his father ruled, being different than how he kind of wants to rule. So we can see that right out of the gate. Now, what I think is also interesting is that his father was also born on an eclipse. And so this is something that I would like to point out. So here's his father. His father is on the outside here. So do you see his father has a Sun-Rahu conjunction in Cancer there? And that the moon just recently, he was born 4 days after an eclipse. Do you guys see the moon at 0 degrees Leo? So he was born during a new moon solar eclipse, when the moon, if you back up the chart a couple days, you'll see that moon going back into Cancer and in a conjunction with the moon Sun Rahu conjunction in Cancer. That was a total solar eclipse that his father was born on too. So not only do we have his son, Alexander II, born on a solar eclipse, his father was also born on a solar eclipse. And as I mentioned, Donald Trump was born on a solar eclipse. A lot of the royals in the British royal family were born on eclipses, lunar or solar. And so we see this a lot with leaders, leaders being born on eclipses, leaders dying on eclipses, leaders, stepping into power and taking over power on eclipses from their family member that died. Like, we see a lot of this eclipsing energy going on. And what I thought was interesting was, even last, and eclipses, as I mentioned before, can oftentimes be known as king killers and represent the blocking out of the sun or the ruler's light. And so can be associated with the destruction of kings or the death of a king. And as I mentioned, when we start looking at the assassination attempts on Alexander's life, we will be seeing some eclipses. Anyway, so let us go ahead. So now we know his father was born on an eclipse. And what's interesting is his father was originally not supposed to rule. His brother was supposed to be the ruler, but never produced any heirs and didn't have any children. So then Alexander's father actually became the Czar of Russia. And so you can see that with eclipses too. Like, his father wasn't supposed to be in line for the throne, but he ended up getting it anyway. And he has that solar eclipse, very powerful. And then his son has a similar solar eclipse in his chart as well. And so I find that very interesting when we're looking at the chart of royals. And if you're an astrologer, that is something to watch out for. If you're studying royal families or the death of royals or the taking up of power of a new royal, watch for eclipses for sure. And so anyway, we do have that going on. Now, his father was not progressive. His father was avoiding change, okay? And now we have a crisis here. We have Sun-Rahu conjunction in Taurus square his ascendant. Now we have a crisis point here. Because my father was unwilling to make the changes that needed to be made in Russian society, now I have all this pressure on me to make these changes that my father did not want to make. Okay. And yeah. So I think that that is interesting too. And just with the sun squaring the ascendant and the eclipse happening and the Rahu conjunction, like that's a lot of pressure to lead. That is already showing a significant amount of pressure to have to lead and come up and kind of carry out what your father was doing or deal with your father's inability to change. All right. Sun in Taurus. And let us go ahead and then, you know, the historians are interesting because they say as much as he looked up to his father, when he came into office, he started following his own beliefs and what he wanted to do. Now, that is interesting too, because we've got the sun in Taurus trine Jupiter. Do you guys see how the sun is trining the Jupiter in Capricorn? And I mentioned earlier, he was born on a Jupiter station as Jupiter was stationing retrograde. So he like changes, but he rules based on his values and his beliefs instead of his own father's as he becomes ruler. But he has this great pressure to lead. And remember that Rahu enhances what it touches. So it's enhancing the sun and that pressure to lead during times of change and crisis. Now, Rahu represents that those changes and those crises that need to happen in order for things to move forward. But when we're in the sign of Taurus with the sun in Taurus, there is that oldness or that resistance to change. Now, one positive thing is that Rahu is actually exalted in Taurus, and Ketu in Scorpio, or the South Node in Scorpio, is exalted in Scorpio. So those are very strong positions for Rahu and Ketu. And Rahu does well in the materialistic sign Taurus, and Ketu does well in the deeply rooted, getting to the bottom of the things sign of Scorpio. So those nodes are very strong, but there is resistance to change, you know, with the Taurus energy there. So that is something to keep in mind. And so he's got some big shoes to fill, looking up at his father in the 10th house there. And Rahu can indicate the highs and the lows and the crises, especially when it's with the sun. The sun is the ruler and the supreme authority. So Rahu represents that roller coaster of highs and lows when it comes to ruling and authority. And so we will be taking a look at that. And, you know, the idea of a stable ruler never changes is kind of, you know, destroyed by having Rahu there, though, I think, and creating crisis in change. And so let's go ahead, and I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in Russian society at the time. So at the time, there was this system of feudalism in Russia. And I actually looked up the definition because I was like, okay, I mean, I know what feudalism is, but let's let's look at it a little different. So feudalism was a system in which people were given land and protection by people of higher rank, and then they worked the land and fought for them in return. So basically feudalism is like a very old landowning system, and it does involve serfs or slaves or people who will work the land, who will fight for their owners and also work the land, but then they get protection from those people that, I mean, think of Game of Thrones, if you will. Like for those of you that have seen Game of Thrones, think of how there would be the people working on like the lord and the nobles, and then they'd have all this land, and they'd have, you know, basically slaves and peasants like working for them. And so that whole, if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know what I mean. So that whole kind of feudalism concept was alive and well in Russia at the time that Alexander took over. Now, Alexander's huge thing, like I said, was taking this land owning society and changing it and turning it into this whole new system. Now, when we think of Taurus, we think of, land. We think of tilling the land. We think of growing crops. We think of banks and finance and money. We think about the economy. Okay, Taurus is a very economical, domestic type of a sign. And, going out there and tilling the land and gardening the land or tilling the land or working the land is about as Taurus as you can get. Now, in his chart here, there is this feudalism that he inherited from his father. But we see Rahu, or the North Node, there, and there is this crisis in land owning society. Now, the reason why there is such a huge change and crisis in land owning society when Alexander is emperor of Russia is because he frees all the slaves that are working the land. So he actually frees 23 million serfs, which was a third of the population in Russia at that time. He goes, and it'd be like in the Game of Thrones. You have all the people working for the lords and the nobles on their land, and then you also just turn to these people and say, you don't have to work here anymore. You don't belong to these people anymore. You don't have to just stay here and live your life out here and be slaves to these people anymore. You can go and work wherever you want and do whatever you want. Well, that creates, it's wonderful, like they have their freedom, but that also creates a lot of problems in society. Now, what do these people do? Where do they work? Where do they go? How do they make money? How do they own land? Right? And so there was a lot of change then. So Alexander, yes, he did free all these slaves, but it really created a lot of disturbances in the economy and with the landowners as well, like the highborn or the lords or the nobles or the landowners. It created a lot of issues because all of a sudden this feudalistic landowning society is all of a sudden changing and transforming. And hi, Sophia. Hi, Sophia. Welcome, my friend. Welcome, my dear. And so, yeah, we have this whole change in Russia where Alexander is telling the serfs, hey, you're free now. But in order to get their own land, they had this crazy redemption program that took a very long time for them to kind of either rent land themselves or get land of their own or buy it back from the landowners. Like there were all these complicated things that needed to happen. And the economy of Russia was very disrupted for a while because the serfs were the one doing the work and creating the grains and the wheat and the exports and all of that. And without them in their roles to do that anymore, then, it did disrupt the Russian economy. And we see that Rahu influence of that disruption of the land-owning economy going on. There was a shaken economy. Rahu, North Node element, introduces instability. But what's interesting with the Venus in Taurus is that he somehow got the landowners to accept the changes and go with it. But you can see, that's that Venus in Taurus in the 10th house. People go with the change and follow him along on the change. But that Venus is also in a quincunx with Uranus, so there was a lot of, unexpected consequences and destabilization and unforeseen consequences there. Of course, we know Taurus is associated with land, economy, grains, farming, feudalism, and the old ways. And with Rahu there and him being born on a solar eclipse, the old ways of doing things are being eclipsed. And I found that really interesting. The other thing that he did is create a ton of new banks and credit bank institutions. He created for the first time ever state banks, municipal banks, saving banks. Like, he created a ton of new banks. And that is also very, Taurus, as far as creating, with the Venus part of fortune conjunction in his 10th house in Taurus, like creating a lot of new banks, a lot of options for people to borrow money and, basically engage more in the economy, which was a positive thing. People generally took that in a positive way, of him creating all these banks and creating all these new opportunities for people to, like borrow money and own land. And so, there was a lot of good here too, but it also created a lot of instability. And we'll talk more about that as well. We also see, like, the sun in Taurus is also trine that Jupiter in Capricorn, and he had like a ton of reforms when it came to the judiciary, the military. Okay, if we think of the military of a country, we'd think about Mars. If we think about the judiciary or the government of a country, we'd think about, or the legal aspect of a country, we'd think about Jupiter. Okay, and we can see the Mars and the Jupiter are opposing one another, but they're in each other's signs in mutual reception. Now, anyway, so it's interesting with Alexander II because he very much had a domestic agenda for his country, where his father wanted to like fight wars and be involved in a ton of wars and all of that. Alexander II was much more focused on the domestic growth of Russia. And part of the reason for that, why Alexander II was so focused on the domestic, which of course Taurus, domestic, he was so focused on the domestic aspect of ruling the country, is that when he became emperor of Russia, his father had just been defeated in a very embarrassing military battle. Now, nothing says as a ruler, I'm inheriting a shitty military like Mars and Cancer in the 12th house. As we know, Mars is associated with, war and the military, etc. The 12th house, when we're going to fight a war, maybe we like a sneak attack. If we're the ones doing the sneaking, okay, it's his 12th house. So, I talked about how he had a lot of assassination attempts on his life, and he does have that Mars in the 12th house. I mean, I can see that secret assassination attempts, but he also inherited like a very shitty military from his father. And, so, part of what he had to do was rebuild the military, opposite Jupiter and Capricorn, okay? Reorganize and rebuild the structures of the military. And because this is a day chart, Jupiter is the most positive planet, Mars is the most negative. So there was a lot of issues in trying to do that and inheriting a very weak military, okay? Mars is in fall in Cancer. It's not great position for Mars, and it is in the 12th house. I inherited a shitty military as a leader, and so I need to focus on the domestic agenda and making Russia domestically relevant again. Okay, all these planets in the 10th house in Taurus, I don't care as much about the military. Military is in the 12th house. I need to make a domestic impact on Russia. And I want to show you guys the chart of his father here. And what's interesting is that his father was a Cancer rising, and his father has Mars retrograde in Sagittarius and a quincunx with his ascendant, and the father also has his own Mars opposite Saturn, okay? War, humiliation, failure in war, losing wars, okay? The father's Mars is opposite the father's Saturn, Alexander's father's Saturn. And one thing to keep in mind, when Alexander became leader of Russia, his father had just lost the Crimean War. And Russia was extremely humiliated as a result of the Crimean War. Like, they lost that war and they lost it bad. Now, his father was always bragging about their military, and most of the world had thought that, wow, Russia has a really strong military. But when the Crimean War happened, it was like, no, this is a really weak military. This is a very poorly organized military, a very bad military, and we are way behind the technology. The Western part of the world has way more advanced technologies than us. Like, we are very, very behind. And so that whole, the father having the Mars opposite Saturn, failure in war, okay, Mars opposite Saturn, that whole failure in war basically led to Alexander. Now we look at Alexander's chart by himself, inheriting a very shitty military with a lot of problems. And oops, now my screen went away. How dare you, screen? Anyway, he inherited a very shitty military with a lot of problems. Mars and Cancer in the 12th house. And so, military might was not his first priority with Mars in the 12th house. Domestic agendas and economic reform were definitely like the main thing that he was trying to do. Also, part of his reform was that Alexander made conscription for all people. Like, you can't skip out on your military service. If you're a high-ranking lord or noble, because you're high ranking doesn't mean you don't have to serve in the military. And that's how it was before. And so under Alexander, he's saying, I don't care if you're high-born, low-born, doesn't matter, peasant, nobleman, whoever, you got to do your time in the military. Every man does. And I think that's very Jupiter and Capricorn, Jupiter and Saturn sign, because Saturn is very much like nobody is getting special privileges. And even if you are high-born, it doesn't matter. You're not above anyone else. Everybody needs to be in the military. And what that did is it expanded the military and made it more fair for everyone. And so we can see, even though military maybe wasn't his top priority, it is in an opposition with that Jupiter and Capricorn, and is being fed mutual reception, which is positive for that Mars through that Jupiter. So he also stopped the process of branding soldiers as well as punishment in the military, and he offered more education and better education to people who were in the military. So you can see Jupiter is the best planet in his chart according to sect, and it is in the mutual reception with the Mars. And so even though the military wasn't his top priority or wasn't his main thing that he was trying to fix, he still managed to do some really good things for the military as far as reform and helping the military out. He did fight a war. He was mainly known as a pacifist. Alexander, his father was very war happy and talked a lot of shit, like, oh, the Russian military is very, very strong and da-da-da. And then they found out, no, it's not. It was a humiliating loss. And Alexander II was more of a pacifist, Mars in the 12th house, okay? Fallen Mars in Cancer, he was more of a pacifist. But there were some foreign wars that he did get involved in, and he did win those wars, but they oftentimes revealed even more problems in the higher echelons of the military. At one point, he tried to engage in doing some naval military reform, okay, Mars in the 12th house, but it failed pretty miserably. We can see that Mars is in a quincunx to Uranus, the planet of new technology, and quincunx is difficult relationship. So what ended up happening when he tried to reform the naval military was basically that they tried to use old technology and make it their own instead of just using the updated Western technology. And the naval reforms did pretty poorly and did pretty bad. Mars in the 12th house, okay, 12th house, water house, the Mars in the 12th house, quincunx the Uranus, trying to take new technologies and copy them from the West, but do them yourselves and not doing them right. And then, just the military itself, Mars in a quincunx to Uranus, like not up to date technologically. So we've got that whole situation, even though he did have, now keep in mind, even though the military wasn't his first priority, he did have some important expansions into Asia. And we can see that Mars rules the 9th house of foreign travel. And it is opposite that Jupiter in mutual reception. And so he did have some decent expansions into Asia. But I feel like with the Jupiter in Saturn sign and Capricorn and fall, that there was just some limitations on resources of what he could kind of dedicate to the military. What he did help out some, but his main focus, the Jupiter trine the Sun in Taurus, were all those domestic issues that Russia was having. And so let's go ahead. I want to talk a little bit about his children next. And let me take a quick drink of water. Okay. And so one thing I found very interesting about Alexander is that he has had so many children, in a time in the world when a lot of children were dying of different diseases and things like that. And, it was hard to, there was no really modern medical care, all of that. Like, he had a ton of children. And his first wife ended up giving him 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. And he also married his mistress after his wife died, who ended up giving him 4 more children. So Alexander ended up having 12 children. Isn't that crazy? How many children he had? And when we look at children in astrology, we look at the 5th house and the ruler of the 5th house. The ruler of that 5th house is it's Sagittarius on the cusp. So the ruler is going to be the Jupiter in Capricorn. Now, that Jupiter in Capricorn is in a trine to his sun. Okay. And he has a lot of children, like a ton, 12 children, tons of sons. But unfortunately, and Jupiter in the chart does show like our ability to have children and especially to have sons in traditional astrology. So he's got a ton of them. All right. But at one point, though, unfortunately, his oldest son did pass away. Okay. So my children are in the 6th house of illness. All right. And he did have a child. His oldest son ended up getting cerebrospinal meningitis and did pass away. And but he still did have, a lot of children. Now, at one point in his life, Alexander took a mistress, and his children were so very mad at him for taking a mistress that they cut him off. A lot of his children cut him off. My children is the Jupiter in Capricorn in the 6th house opposite the Mars. The Mars is the worst planet in the chart. We have a day chart. My children are opposite Mars. I lost a child. Not only did I have a lot of children, but not only did my first child die, but many of my children cut me off. Okay. All right. My children opposite Mars. Many of my children cut me off because I had an affair. Okay. And so we can see the aspect with the children in his chart, and kind of what triggered the whole cutting off in general was the death of his wife. Okay. So if we're looking at the ruler of the 7th house, okay, Saturn is the ruler of the 7th house. Saturn is in the 8th house of death. Okay. So my wife's death, ruler of the 7th in the 8th house, changes, okay, my relationship with my children. My wife squaring Uranus in the 5th house of children. My wife's death changes my relationship with my children. Uranus and Sagittarius in the 5th house. Okay, because when his wife died, basically, He got remarried even without waiting the 40 days to, like, quote unquote mourn. He just married his mistress right away, and his children were very pissed off, and many of them became estranged from him because he went and did that. And, and it was something that he was very sad about and carried a lot of guilt and sadness about. And I thought it was also interesting, too, that history mentioned that his daughter was actually his favorite child. That Jupiter, representing the fifth house of children, is in a trine relationship to the Venus in Taurus. Of course, Venus represents women and daughters. My children in a trine to Venus. I love my daughter. I love my female child. Okay. The male children, not so much. They are cutting me off because I had an affair with, had an affair and married the mistress and all that type of stuff. So the children family aspect of his chart is very interesting as well, I thought. And let's see what else we have going on here. So I wanted to bring up Abraham Lincoln. Now, the reason why I bring up Abraham Lincoln is because at the time that, let me go and see here, Abraham Lincoln. Okay, I think I have to... Abraham Lincoln. Okay. All right. What's really interesting between Alexander II and Abraham Lincoln. Now, obviously, Alexander II freed 23 million serfs or slaves. And we know that Abraham Lincoln freed slaves as well. And the funny thing about it is, history often compares them a lot. But funny thing about it is they were ruling at the same time. Now, it's interesting because Alexander II freed the slaves on the day before Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. So he freed the slaves in Russia the day before Abraham Lincoln became president in the U.S. Now, that is interesting because Abraham Lincoln was, president during the Civil War, freed the slaves. Alexander, was emperor of Russia during a very unstable time when the country was going through a lot of changes. And, this whole thing of him freeing 23 million people, 1/3 of the population of Russia, I mean, massive, massive overhaul, massive, massive change. And, Abraham Lincoln across the ocean in the Western world was going through similar transition. And so, of course, I got curious and I brought up their charts and compared them together because I'm like, and right away, of course, you can see Abraham Lincoln's sun in Aquarius and Ascendant in Aquarius is right on the moon in Aquarius for Alexander II. Like, there is a conjunction there between Abraham Lincoln's sun and Ascendant and Alexander II's moon in Aquarius. Now, I think that that's interesting because, Aquarius oftentimes, and there is a side of Aquarius that isn't always like freedom loving and humanitarian and like the modern man and all of that. There is a side of Aquarius that can be very like fundamentalist as well. But in this case, there is that kind of humanitarian side of we need to for future generations, thinking into the future, like progression in society, liberal progression in society, like thinking bigger, thinking outside of the box. This type of Aquarian ideal of free people before they uprise against you. You want to free these people. Like all of this type of stuff is very Aquarian, and Abraham Lincoln and Alexander II both share that kind of Aquarius impulse within them. I also think it's interesting because Abraham Lincoln was born 9 years before Alexander II. And so his nodes, his north and south node, are also in Taurus and Scorpio. And they're right on top of Abraham Lincoln's nodes, or on top of Alexander II's nodes. And so eclipses, because they are aligned eclipse-wise, the eclipses that are happening are going to be impacting them kind of both at the same time in a similar way. And you can also see here too that Uranus in Scorpio for Abraham Lincoln is right there with his Rahu in Scorpio. And now their nodes are reversed. So Alexander has Rahu, or the North Node, in Taurus, and Abraham Lincoln has his Rahu in Scorpio, because they are born 9 years apart. So that's like the halfway point for the nodes. But Abraham Lincoln has that Uranus North Node conjunction. His major fate in life mission to lead people through this massive time of bloody unrest and war and change, and at deep personal cost to him. Rahu and Scorpio at deep painful cost to him. That karma of him taking on that change and leading that change in our country. And their Aquarian planets really lining up there and showing that kind of, they also, they're also from, both of them are from the Pluto and Pisces generation. And, those humanitarian kind of change and hope and inspiration and, better future, that all is part of the Pisces plan there as well. And you can see a lot of their Pisces planets are matching up there too. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting to look at their charts and see. Abraham Lincoln has the moon in Capricorn, which is a little too far to say that it's in a conjunction with his Jupiter and Capricorn, but so it's kind of interesting looking at their two charts, especially because as Alexander II was like freeing all these slaves, Abraham Lincoln was just stepping into office to be president of the United States. So that is a very interesting juxtaposition there. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the emancipation of the slaves. Let me go ahead and bring that up here, and let's see if we can find. So this is when Alexander II freed 23 million slaves. This is the chart. He did it on March 3rd of 1861, one day before Abraham Lincoln took office. Now, here is the chart for it. Now, one thing I really want to point out to you guys that maybe some of you have already noticed as well. Before we look at that chart, I just want to bring us back to something here. And I want to show you in Alexander II's chart, he has a Saturn-Uranus square. Now, this is a really important aspect in his chart, okay? Do you see how he has Saturn in Pisces square Uranus in Sagittarius? Do you guys see that there? This is a square between these two planets. Now, one thing that I kind of was looking at is the synodic cycle between Saturn and Uranus, because in astrology, we have something called synodic cycles, and basically they represent so Saturn and Uranus are forming over time, over a 45-year period. They form a conjunction first with each other, then they square each other, then they oppose each other, then they square each other again, and then they come back into conjunction again. So it takes about 43 to 45 years for Saturn and Uranus to come into a conjunction together and start that whole cycle over again of Saturn squaring Uranus, Saturn opposing Uranus, Saturn squaring Uranus again, and then making the conjunction. It's a 45-year synodic cycle. And basically, Alexander was born during a Saturn-Uranus square, okay? During the opening square, so during the waxing square, the opening phase of Saturn square to Uranus, during the first waxing square of that Saturn-Uranus cycle, okay? And I think that the Saturn-Uranus square is very interesting in his chart, because there are so many things in his chart that show that, man, you are going to have a stressful time ruling during these times of change. Because not only is he born with an eclipse, okay, his the eclipse energy here at the top of his chart is squaring his ascendant, a lot of pressure to change. Okay, he's got the moon at 29 degrees Aquarius square the Mercury in Taurus, the new ideals squaring the old ideals, okay, the repression of thought, but then also the need to free these slaves and help humanity in that way, but also struggling against the old worn out ideas of the past, okay, Mercury and Taurus. And then you also have in his chart, icing on the cake, you've got the Saturn-Uranus square. Now, when we have a Saturn-Uranus square, and it's interesting because in 2021, we had multiple hits of Saturn squaring Uranus. So we just had the waning square in 2021 going on. And so we are right now in a current Saturn-Uranus cycle. And we'll be heading to the conjunction, I think, in early 2030, 2031. We'll be back to a Saturn-Uranus conjunction again. So we're in the middle of this right now. But Alexander II was born into the middle of a very heightened waxing square of Saturn squaring Uranus. And what that tells me, of course, is Saturn represents authority and discipline, limitations, the old ways. Uranus represents rebellion, change, the need to do things differently. And when they're squaring each other, we see this battle of, the new way trying to emerge, but the old way is teetering and struggling. And because Alexander II was born during this Saturn-Uranus square, man, that on top of everything else in his chart, it basically, the pressure to lead during times of intense change. And when you have Saturn squaring Uranus, you've got the old way fighting against the new way. You've got the tension of the new versus the old. And, there's a lot of problems with that. And there's the collapsing of old structures and then the raising of new structures. But everything is very in the waxing square or the beginning phases of the waxing square. It's all very new. And new problems are like springing up out of nowhere. And there's like this feeling of immediacy. We need to do something now. But then there is maybe a lack of realizing the implications of changing everything all at once. And in this chart, Uranus is, overcoming the Saturn. And, there's an ideological influence with the Uranus and Sagittarius. But with the Saturn in Pisces, I feel like there's a lot of problems that are like sleeping that they don't know about. And once they start instituting these changes, all these sleeping problems that they didn't even think about start coming out of the woodwork. And so I think that this is a very interesting aspect in Alexander II's natal chart that shows, wow, man, you are going to have a tough time ruling during these times of change. But also because he has the square, he is like the anointed one in the fact that you are the leader that can help us carry us through these changes, because you get the old ways versus the new. You were raised with your father who had the old ways, and you get where we're trying to go in the future. And you're the person that is going to be stuck trying to work that out. And so I think that is a very, interesting energy in his chart. And it's even more interesting when you take into account that when he freed those slaves in the Emancipation, when Alexander freed those slaves, there was also, Not Abraham Lincoln. I'm sorry. Let's see here. Alexander the Second. There's all his assassinations. Where is just regular Alexander? Alexander, there you are. Okay. So what is really interesting is on the day that he freed all those slaves in Russia, there was, and this is, this happened. So keep in mind, Alexander in his natal chart, he has the Saturn-Uranus square right there in his natal chart, as we talked about, opening, waxing square. Now, when the emancipation happens, 43 to 44 years later, after Alexander was born, we are in the middle of another waxing square between Saturn and Uranus. So at the time that he freed the slaves, Uranus was in Gemini, okay, in the 11th house, and it is square Saturn in Virgo in the 2nd house, okay? And so at the time of Alexander's birth, he was born during a Saturn-Uranus waxing square, and 45 years later, when he goes to free those slaves, at the end of the beginning of a new Saturn-Uranus synodic cycle during the waxing square, he frees the slaves. And I thought that that was really interesting because he was born with it, and then at the time he was freeing the slaves, it's there too, the Saturn-Uranus square. Now, interestingly, like I told you, Abraham Lincoln was also inaugurated into office one day after this chart. So when Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, he also has the Saturn-Uranus square in his inauguration chart. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was trying to deal with two different divided United States, like the ones that wanted the new changes, the North, and the South that didn't want things to change, representing the Saturn energy. And you can see he's going to struggle with that too, just the way that Alexander is struggling with the Saturn-Uranus square as well. And so I think that that is very interesting, looking at the cycle of Saturn and Uranus and the struggle for nations to industrialize and get with the times and catch up to progress, right? But then it's hard because there's all these problems that come out of the woodwork. And I think that that is really interesting to look at. And yeah, we need better technology. We're struggling with old ideas, okay? And Saturn-Uranus type stuff. And like I said, Saturn represents structure, discipline, and responsibility. Uranus represents innovation, rebellion, and freedom to change. Very different energies. And squaring each other, yeah, there's a lot of that going on for both Alexander II and Abraham Lincoln. Okay, now I want to... And, keeping in mind that out of like all the quote unquote, major powers or modern powers of the world, like the US and Russia were two of the last countries to quote unquote need to free slaves. Like most of the other like modern nations had already like done away with slavery. It was really the United States and Russia that were still holding on to that old, paradigm. And so you see that you see the parallels now coming up between Alexander and Abraham Lincoln. And interesting that they also both were assassinated as well too. And, oftentimes very divisive leaders who try to institute all this change. Yeah, like it creates a lot of enemies, So with that, I want to go ahead and show you guys, now that I've showed you the Emancipation, I've showed you Abraham Lincoln, I want to show you the first assassination. Now I'm going to go into the different assassination attempts on his life, on Alexander II, and I'm going to show you the final death chart as well. and we will take it from there. Okay, so let's start with, and now there were 7 assassination attempts on his life, and on the 7th one, he died. I have time, or not time, but I have dates, exact dates for 5 of the, let me see, actually 3, 4, 5. Yeah, for 5 of them. So I'm missing one of them. I'm missing one assassination. I couldn't find it. One assassination attempt. I could not find that one, but I did find 5 of them, and the final one where he lost his life. Now, this was an interesting study because in the first place in his natal chart, some things that I find interesting are, you know, the Mars in fall in the 12th house, okay? And, you know, secret assassination attempts. And we are going, but he manages to dodge a lot of those attempts, and he manages to, not until the 7th time does he actually get hit. Now, what's interesting, what's protecting him a little bit, I think, is this Jupiter in Capricorn. Now, as a day chart, Jupiter is the most positive planet. And as I explained before, Jupiter is in Capricorn, which Mars is exalted in Capricorn. You know, so Mars wants some of that Jupiter energy, and Jupiter wants some of that Mars energy because Mars is in Cancer, Jupiter's sign of exaltation. That's the mutual reception. And so while he has all these secret plots to kill him, he ends up surviving a lot of them, actually. And so first of all, just kind of looking at his natal chart, and at one point even they had targeted his family. And we can see family is represented by the ruler of the 4th house, which would be that Mars is the ruler of the 4th house of family. And we can see that Uranus in a quincunx to the ruler of the 4th house of family. Now, a lot of bombing, when I've been researching bombing in astrology, like bombing attempts and or just actual bombs that went off, Uranus is typically involved in those. And I've come to kind of think that Uranus is associated with bombing. Probably also Mars, Pluto, but like those surprise bombing attacks, that is a very Uranian type of a thing. And at one point, there was a plan against his family which almost took his entire family out, to assassinate him and blow up his home. Ruler of the 4th house, quincunx Uranus. Okay. That's interesting there. And then also Mars rules the 9th house of foreign travel. And there was an assassination attempt on him when he was traveling in another country as well, which I also think is kind of interesting. And so let me go ahead, and I want to show you guys the first assassination attempt. Okay, so let's go ahead and see here. And the very first, look at, I have all the assassination 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's a death there. So this is the first assassination attempt on his life, which happened on April 4th, 1866. And what happened here? So right away, I went to, so on the inside circle here is Alexander's natal chart. On the outside circle are the transits that were happening on the day that I'll remove all those lines. But the outside circle is the day that basically the assassination attempt number 1 happened. Now, keep in mind that at the time of this first assassination attempt, my eye went straight to the Sun K2 conjunction because I thought, okay, where's the moon at? And because if the moon is over here with the north node, was over here with the north node a couple days ago, which it was, then there would have been a lunar eclipse right around the time that assassination attempt, the very first attempt, was taken on his life. Now, I looked up the dates in 1866, and indeed, okay, there was a lunar eclipse on March 31st, And so there was it was actually a total lunar eclipse 4 days before the assassination attempt occurred. Okay. So remember earlier in the lecture when I was talking about how oftentimes world leaders are born on eclipses, they can be assassinated on eclipses, there can be attempts on their life on eclipses, new power can be handed over to the next generation on eclipses. So right away when I saw that, I was like, okay, there was an attempt. The very first assassination attempt happened 4 days after a total lunar eclipse. And wow, that must have been very shocking and tough for him. And it happened at 10 degrees Libra. Now, that total solar eclipse at 10 degrees Libra, 4 days before that assassination attempt, would have been squaring his Mars-Jupiter opposition, okay? At 10 degrees Libra, it would have been squaring that Mars-Jupiter opposition that we've been talking about there. And as I mentioned earlier, solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, these are oftentimes referred to as king killers and can represent like the assassination of a monarch for sure. And they used to be very feared. And keep in mind, guys, astrology has been around for thousands of years, and that the ancients would look up at the sky and watch the sun getting eaten by Rahu. Like they would watch the sun basically disappear and be devoured. And that was a very fearful experience for people. And there were astrologers, thousands of years ago that were tracking eclipses. And, monarchs had astrologers under their, were employed under monarchs. And astrologers would warn monarchs, like, there's an eclipse coming. And monarchs would, like, go into hiding, or they would even have, like, a fake body double act like them and go out in public, because it just was so many times. Like there would be great wars started on eclipses, there would be assassination of world leaders and major political figures. Like it's just over and over and over, and astrologers were predicting these things to the point where leaders would actually, like, for a couple days would kind of just like disappear, and it'd almost be like they had like a body double stepping in for them, which I find very interesting. Like the power of astrology, and even thousands of years ago, people were aware of these influences and what could happen. Now, interestingly, like the very first attempt on his life happened right around a lunar eclipse and is squaring the Mars-Jupiter opposition. I think another interesting thing that was happening in his chart at that time is there was a Saturn-Pluto opposition, and those are nasty. Like, I don't try to... Saturn-Pluto, that's a tough... Saturn-Pluto is a very, very tough energy. And that Saturn was on his south node, okay? Transiting Saturn was on his south node, and Pluto was up there on his Sun and Rahu, okay? So Saturn, Pluto were across his Sun and node. That must have been a very terrifying experience for him. And indeed, in 1866, shortly after that, we saw Alexander like kind of go backwards on his reform. Remember when I mentioned earlier that Jupiter was stationary when he was born and was one day from going retrograde? It's like all the momentum of that reform that he was doing just kind of like, once somebody tried to take his life, it's like all of a sudden his policies became more conservative, and he started getting rid of his liberal advisors, and like it must have scared the shit out of him. Probably, I'm guessing for sure that someone had taken a shot at him, fired a shot at him, but they missed. And again, I think, Mars in the 12th house and the assassination attempts, the secret assassination attempts, fortified and bonified by Jupiter in the 6th house, by mutual reception, helping out that Mars. So the person takes a shot at him, it misses, it doesn't hit him, but like, whoa, what a scary experience. And I also think with the Saturn Pluto challenging his sun and his nodes there, that a lot of the reform that he did was probably in some I know it was also hurt the economy in some ways, because it's like, well, what do we do now with all this land? You know, what do we do with all the peasants? What do we do with all the former slaves? Like, you know, and people just, you know, being unhappy with the progress. I could see where, and him having a lot of fear about what he had done to create such, you know, mortal enemies, basically. I can definitely see that with the Saturn Pluto opposition hitting his 4th and 10th house, hitting his Sun-Rahu conjunction as well. And, you know, interestingly, at the time, this was the very first assassination attempt. And you can see Uranus just entering his 12th house at the moment of that assassination attempt. And as Uranus is going to kind of keep moving towards his Mars, right? Mars, of course, is assassination attempts, etc. As that, you know, Uranus keeps getting closer, we got more and more chances that that Mars is going to be activated in some type of a surprising, accident, brutal, ruthless way. Okay. And what I think is interesting is that the Jupiter also rules his 8th house of death. Okay. And so, like, people keep trying to assassinate him. My 8th house is opposite Mars in the 12th house. People keep trying to assassinate me, but they keep missing me because Jupiter is my best planet in this entire chart and I'm not getting hit. Okay. So that is a very interesting aspect. And I think with the Saturn Pluto opposition hitting his 4th and 10th house, like, a lot of fear about what would happen to him and his family. Yeah. So, you know, everything is starting to become a crisis. That is the first attempt. Now, let's look at the second assassination attempt on him. And we are going to go ahead and assassination 2. Oh, shoot. And all right, let's bring that back. Okay, so here is the second attempt on his life. This was on June 8th of 1867. So this is not even, let's see, the first one was April of, yeah, this is like a year and a couple months later. So this is like a year later. He has another attempt on his life. And this time he's in Paris with Napoleon III. And they are in a carriage. And he is overseas in a foreign country. And somebody takes a shot at them. And it doesn't kill him. But he is in a foreign country. And I had mentioned earlier about how Mars rules his 9th house of foreign countries, okay? And it's in this 12th house here, all right? And we've got the ruler of the 8th house opposing the ruler of the 9th house. So it's like, you know, I'm getting killed in a foreign country, or I almost get killed in a foreign country, but thank God it's my Jupiter and not my Saturn or some other thing that gets opposed by Mars, because my Jupiter is my best planet and it saves me. And but you will note that a year later, that Uranus is getting even closer to his Mars in Cancer there. It's getting within 10 degrees of that Mars in Cancer. We've got Mars transiting his 1st house as well, opposing his moon. All right, opposing his moon in Aquarius there. So not a great day as far as, you know, violence to the body with the Mars in Leo in the 1st house. Okay, and keep in mind Mars is the most malefic planet in his chart because he has a day chart now. He's got Mars transiting his 1st house, opposing his moon on the day that happens. Okay, and Mars rules his 9th house, as I mentioned. He's having eclipses at that time. Do you see where the eclipses are happening? And again, this assassination attempt didn't happen on an eclipse like the first one, but the eclipses are currently happening in Pisces and Virgo and happen to be happening on his Saturn. Okay, so the eclipses are happening at this point on his Saturn in Pisces in the 8th house. And so that is also dangerous as well. But I actually think, and here's another thing I want to point out. And Jupiter, do you see Jupiter in his 8th house of death, transiting Jupiter at 6 degrees Pisces in his 8th house of death? Jupiter is protecting him in his 8th house. Now, we will see this multiple times in these assassination charts, even 12 years later, when he has assassination attempts on his life 12 years later, when Jupiter is in Pisces again and is protecting him in his 8th house. And so we see that protection element of Jupiter there. The other thing that was happening at that time during this second assassination attempt was, at that time, he was also taking a mistress. And keep in mind that the eclipses are happening on his Saturn in Pisces, and Saturn rules his 7th house of relationships. And not only are the eclipses happening on his 7th house ruler of relationships, he has a transiting Venus-Pluto conjunction hitting his natal Venus, okay? And nothing says, I'm betraying my wife and taking a mistress like a Venus-Pluto conjunction on your natal Venus, okay? Especially with Saturn opposing your natal Venus as well, okay? And so to me, the second assassination attempt, he's got Jupiter in his 8th house protecting him. But the main thing that I feel about this chart is the starting of the relationship with his mistress, and the going behind his family's back. Saturn and Scorpio in the 4th house, the going behind his family's back in order to be with this mistress. Okay. And I feel like that eclipse is really pointing out, the kind of start of that relationship and the ruining of his marriage in a lot. Now, his marriage didn't officially get ruined until like his wife was sick and she died, but he has a mistress. So, hey, it's getting ruined in the process, right? And what's interesting is that his son, who became king, who is estranged from his father for taking a mistress while his mom was ill, and things like that. Like his son, who eventually became king, was like, oh, my father died like because he took a mistress. Like basically he fucked our family over and took a mistress, and that's karma, and that's why he died. So I think that is interesting as well, with that second assassination attempt and all the Venus-Pluto, and that is around the time that his relationship started with his mistress. Interesting times, my friends, okay? Now, let's go to the third assassination attempt, and we will go to assassination number 3, okay? And this one was on April 20th, 1879, okay? So this is 12 years later, 12 years later. And, Jupiter has like a 12-year cycle. So Jupiter will go back into the same sign after 12 years. So what's interesting, again, I'm like, wait a second, it's like 12 years later. And I'm like, oh, yeah, there's Jupiter in Pisces again in his 12th house. So he had those 2 attempts on his life. 12 years go by. He doesn't have any more attempts until Jupiter goes into Pisces again. And as Jupiter is going in through his 8th house, he's going to be having about a 1.5 year long transit where there's going to be multiple attempts on his life. But Jupiter's going to be in Pisces the whole time, and everybody who tries to get him misses. Now, that's when Jupiter, the most positive planet in your chart, is transiting your 8th house. It's mitigating your death, okay? So your death is not happening at that point. Now, that's a good thing, but what I don't like about the next couple of years for Alexander is that the nodes have now, the North and South node, have now moved into Capricorn, Cancer, okay? And because the nodes move backwards at the very beginning of this assassination, the nodes are just entering into Capricorn, Cancer, and over the next year and a half, there's going to be 3 attempts on his life, okay? Luckily, he's got Jupiter and Pisces in the 8th house of death, mitigating his death, but during the whole year and a half, and we know Mars, the worst planet in the chart, is in Cancer in the 12th house. As these nodes are going through Cancer, Capricorn, multiple attempts on his life, okay? And on the day, on this day, on April 20th, 1879, a student from a university who is part of a revolutionary group attempts to assassinate him. Now, what I think is interesting is the Saturn in Aries directly on his midheaven in the 9th house, okay? And a student from a university trying to assassinate him, okay? Saturn at 8 degrees Aries on his midheaven in the 9th house. Now, the 9th house is associated with universities and students, and Saturn in Aries is a very frustrated, angry energy in the hands of a wrong person and somebody who really hates him, and a young student who hates him and tries to kill him. Now, that Saturn in Aries is squaring the Jupiter, okay, challenging the Jupiter there, and we've got that going on. So a shot is fired by a university student in St. Petersburg. Saturn in Aries in the 9th house on the degree of his midheaven, squaring his natal Mars and Jupiter. And here we see the hatred for his policies and the hatred for his beliefs. And we see the genuine frustration and anger in society rising up against him, Saturn in Aries, okay? And on the day of this failed assassination, there is also a Mars-Pluto square. So Mars is on his natal moon. Now keep in mind, remember the second assassination attempt had the moon had Mars opposite his moon on the second assassination attempt. And now on the third one, Mars is in a conjunction with his moon. Okay, but not only is Mars on his moon, but Mars is also, which Mars is the ruler of the 12th house, a house of great misfortune and secret plots and secret enemies on his moon. His moon rules his 12th house. So again, we see that moon at a crisis point there. Assassination attempt number 2, Mars is opposing his moon. Assassination attempt number 3, Mars is on his moon. And the unfortunate aspect here is the Mars is also, there on the day of that assassination attempt, there's a Mars square Pluto as well. Mars at 23 degrees Aquarius square Pluto in Taurus at 25 degrees Taurus. Now that is also triggering Alexander's Mercury square Mars that I've talked about, pretty extensively, about how, he freed the slaves and he gave them, he gave them their freedom back, but there's these conflicting old ideas, particularly by merchants and students. And, it was revolutionaries that assassinated him. But I also have to think of who paid for all these assassination attempts, who funded it, I would have to think Mercury and Taurus. I would have to think it with the part of fortune. I would have to with Venus and Taurus. I would have to think some of those wealthy, highborn society people funded that. Okay. And I don't know that for a fact, but I mean, who is funding all these assassination attempts and who is behind them? Sure, it's these students from these universities or these revolutionaries, but who is funding these groups and where is the vitriol actually coming from, right? So I think that that's interesting. And, you know, Mars square Pluto on the day of the assassination, my powerful enemies are trying to basically get me back and take revenge on me for the things that they hate about what I'm doing and, you know, the legacy that I'm leaving, basically. And people have major issues with his policies. Mars square Pluto on that day, powerful enemies hitting his moon Mercury square with ideological differences. You know, Mercury square moon, ideological differences with his enemies, Mars square Pluto. Okay. So we've got that attempt number 3 that happened. Now let's go ahead and look at attempt number 4. We're just rolling through them here. And the 4th attempt on his life here. Oh, I keep. Let's see. And assassination attempt number 4. Oh, no. I'm trying to get this the second one up. Let's see. It's past my bedtime, you guys. Let's see the 4th assassination attempt. So here we have the 4th assassination attempt. And this one was a particularly nasty one. Actually, no, I'm sorry. This was, we're not at the 5th one. The 5th one I feel is a pretty nasty one. Okay, but this one happened on December 1st, 1879, which is about 7 to 8 months after the last one happened. So Jupiter is still in Pisces in his 8th house, protecting him. Oops, guys, let me bring that back. So Jupiter is still in his 8th house protecting him, transiting Jupiter. Okay, 7 months later, it's still there. Great, right? He needs that there. But look at where the nodes have transited to. So the South Node in Cancer is right on top of his Mars and right on top of his Jupiter there with the North Node, okay? And on the day that it happens, the moon is in the early degrees of Cancer. Now, this attempt, number 4, on December 1st, was a bomb that was planted in a railway by a revolutionary group called the People's Will. And they had planted a bomb on a railway that he was supposed to be traveling on, but he changed his mind and decided to take a different route. You know, and what I think is very interesting here is the Venus, the transiting Venus in Libra in domicile in his 3rd house of short distance travel. Okay. So he decides to take a different route, Venus in the 3rd house, and it saves his ass, right? And the other thing that I think is interesting is on the day of this assassination attempt, Mars was retrograde in Taurus in a conjunction with Neptune. And this is a pretty weak Mars. And, you know, nothing says my enemies are weak today like a Mars in Taurus in a conjunction with Neptune. So enemies are not that powerful that day. Yes, they try to take a hit on him, but he's got the benefic Venus in his 3rd house of short distance travel. He decides to take a different route. Now, that Saturn in Aries is still there, retrograding on his midheaven. It's still the same people that tried to assassinate him the 3rd time. Like, it's still those same people that are trying to do it, that have ideological differences with him and are very angry at his policies. But I think another thing that was, I mean, we've got the Jupiter in the 8th house protecting him again. But the other thing that I think is interesting is Mercury that day, because Mercury was also retrograde in Sagittarius in the transit chart in a conjunction with Alexander's natal Neptune. So nothing says travel plans getting fucked up like Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius on Alexander II's Neptune. I don't know where you're going. I think I know where you're going. where are you going? And it was that whole Venus in the third house of short distance travel and domicile strongly there, and having a weak Mars that day, and then the Jupiter in his eighth house. And I also think the confusion about his travel plans, Mercury and Sagittarius on his Neptune, the confusion about his travel plans that stopped that assassination number 4 from happening. So now we are on to, Sparkles of Gold, my friend. Hello. Hello, hello. Thank you for dropping in. And thank you for the comment about telling me good job. Thank you so much. I was getting my car serviced today, and I had to wait like 3 hours at the car dealership, and I just started doing all these assassination attempts. And I was like, let me take a look at all these attempts, okay? So it was time well spent, I think. And let's go ahead and let's look at assassination attempt number 5. And then we are almost home, folks. Then we are almost to his death, okay? And let me go ahead and pull up assassination number 5. And let's see here. And there's that. Okay. So this is the one that I think is kind of nasty with the assassination attempt number 5. And it didn't go off, meaning that he did not get killed on this attempt, but it was bad. And the thing that I think it really highlights is the natal aspect in his natal chart, where I told you guys earlier how Mars rules the 4th house of family. And my family is in my 12th house, okay? Mars in the 12th house. And, Mars is in a quincunx to Uranus. And nothing says like, a secret assassination on my family and me, okay, that almost results in a tragic accident, like the ruler of the 4th house and the 12th house in a quincunx to Uranus. And that's exactly what happened on assassination number 5, or what they tried to do is the bombers tried to put a bomb underneath the dining room of his home, and they were going to blow up his entire family, men, women, children, everything. And the great aunt ended up being late for dinner and holding everyone up. And so when the bomb went off at Winter Palace, at one of his palaces where all of him and his family were, they weren't in the dining room at the time. So none of the family got hurt, which, again, my family is in an opposition to Jupiter, which is the best planet in my chart, in mutual reception with my Mars, which is helping out this Mars fallen in Cancer. And so even though somebody does try to plot a terrible accident, bombing, etc. on my family, ruler of the 4th house and the 12th house, quincunx the Uranus, they're not able to go through with it because Jupiter is my protector. Basically, Jupiter is the best planet in the chart. And again, Jupiter is still in his 8th house, okay? And Jupiter in the 8th house protecting him from death. And this time, Jupiter has progressed to being right on top of his Saturn at the time, okay? And the Jupiter on the Saturn, I think, is also around the time where his wife was ill and was passing away. But I think she'd been ill and suffering for a long time. And, once she passes away, then he gets to marry his mistress, which, Saturn rules the 7th house of his relationships, and after his wife's illness, he marries the mistress. We can see that at the time that the Jupiter is on the ruler of the 7th house, that his wife passes away, wife in the 8th house, and he marries his mistress. So that was also going on at the same time too. But as we know, Jupiter is bonifying his 8th house and creating a good circumstances, and it's so funny to me because you guys know the Jupiter and Taurus transits that we've been having. Now Jupiter's gone into Gemini, but Taurus rules my 8th house in my chart. And, I am a Taurus, and like, the Jupiter in Taurus transit for me has been kind of, I don't know, it's been kind of shit. Like, it hasn't really, what's interesting is I had a Sun-Jupiter conjunction on my birthday. The Jupiter Cazimi was on my birthday this year, and nothing really like amazing happened to me, but one good thing did happen in the sense that my boyfriend did receive an inheritance, which of course the 8th house represents, your partner's money, and it also represents inheritances. And, my boyfriend did get an inheritance, so I can say that. But like, I don't know, maybe Jupiter in my 8th house was protecting me from dying, but like, you don't know unless you know, right? But the Jupiter in the 8th house wasn't exactly doing, an amazing, wondrous thing for me. And Jupiter is actually the best planet in my chart. So, I was kind of, I don't know, I was kind of pissed off at the manifestation gods, to be honest. I was like, and now, I have the whole year to experience the Jupiter Cazimi. But like, I'm like, okay, if I'm having a Jupiter Cazimi on my birthday, like, this shit better be good, but it wasn't like the amazing, like, parade of excellence that that one may have thought. But anyway, at the same time, like, we can see Jupiter in his 8th house and what this was doing for Alexander II. 12 years ago, it protected him from multiple assassination attempts. And then now, 12 years later, he's got Jupiter in Pisces again in his 8th house, and it's protecting him again. And so, yeah, I think that is a very interesting energy that he has going on with the Jupiter and Pisces in the 8th house. And yeah, he's protecting him from death. And also on that day, transiting Venus is on his natal Jupiter, juicing up that natal Jupiter, the best planet in his chart, juicing up that natal Jupiter even more. And it's the Venus is also opposite the ruler of his 4th house of family. And so, yeah, like, he ends up not getting bombed, and his family ends up okay that day. And, the transiting planets end up really kind of protecting him. And, but I think what's also interesting is the Mars-Pluto at the top of his chart here, just showing how serious everything has gotten, and just how, like, it's hitting his house, his family, like, just how nerve-wracking and how much pressure is on him with the Mars-Pluto conjunction there too, with his enemies just kind of grinding away at him. So that is definitely going on. Now, let's go ahead and look at the chart of his death, you guys. Let us go and let's pick the death chart. Okay, so this is the final death chart. And will you guys take a gander at this and note that Jupiter is no longer in Pisces in his 8th house. Jupiter has now moved into Aries. Okay, and this, when he dies, this is about 3 months after the bombing attempt on his palace with his family, the last attempt. This is about 4 months after that. And this is the day of his death. And as you can see, Jupiter has left his 8th house of death and is no longer, taking care of his 8th house. Jupiter has moved into a conjunction with Saturn, which is interesting because on his birthday, on his day of death, we have what we call a great conjunction, which is a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, which only happens once every 20 years. Now, before I was talking about the Saturn-Uranus synodic cycle and how he was born with a Saturn-Uranus square and leading during times of great change. and all of that. But on his death, we see Jupiter making a conjunction with Saturn, meeting up with Saturn, and we see the limit. We see how growth is going to be limited under his son, Alexander III. Okay. So once Alexander the Second dies, his son is going to take over, and his son is going to go right back to those repressive, conservative policies that Alexander the Second's father had. So what we see now is we see a great conjunction happening once every 20 years on the day that he dies, and we see Jupiter hitting Saturn. Like no more forward momentum. No more, like, progress is going to be limited. And you know what's interesting is when I kind of looked at his son's chart, the one that takes over after Alexander II dies, and he has multiple planets in Aries, multiple. He has a Moon Pluto conjunction around the same degrees of this Saturn Jupiter conjunction. Nothing says, Moon Pluto, death of a family member, like a Moon Pluto conjunction getting activated in the sun's natal chart, death of a parent, and this snapping of a rubber band that happens when the father dies and Jupiter runs into Saturn, and it's like no more progress. Okay. So there's that whole thing that happens on the day of his death. And what I think is also interesting is Uranus is transiting. Uranus is opposite his natal Saturn. And we see kind of like the whole Saturn-Uranus theme kind of coming out again here. And but the thing that really stuck out to me is, well, again, he has Mars in the 7th house. And we know on Assassination Attempt 3, he also had Mars in the 7th house, and Mars is getting close to making a conjunction with that moon. We saw that before. So the Mars in the 7th house the Mars is actually squaring his sun in Taurus as well. So we've got a Mars square sun there going on. The thing that really got him on the day that he died was a really kind of dumb decision that he made. Now, look at that Mercury retrograde in Pisces, okay? On the day that he died, Mercury was retrograde in Pisces and is on that Saturn, that natal Saturn. Now, what ended up happening on the day that he died, he was in his carriage, and he had a bulletproof carriage that could withstand a lot that Napoleon III had gifted him. And so when he was in a carriage, someone threw a bomb at him, and the first bomb went off, but it did kill people, but it didn't hurt him because he was in the carriage. And he probably just should have kept going and gone home or left or just gotten out of the way. But instead, he gets out of the carriage to inspect the damage and to, see if everyone's okay and ask about the wounded. And he's like hanging outside of the carriage, and a second bomber throws a bomb right at his feet. Saturn in Pisces, okay, throws the bomb right at his feet. Pisces ruling the 8th house of death. And it rips off his feet and his legs. And it punctures a hole in his abdomen, Mars in Cancer, okay? And he starts bleeding to death, but he's still alive. And they take him on a sleigh back to the palace. And he, like, within an hour, he's dead. He basically bleeds out, and that's it. And when I saw the Saturn-Chiron-Pluto conjunction in the 8th house, I was like, oh, man, that sounds like a really tough death, as the 8th house represents our death. And like I was like, yeah, it kind of sounds like a rough death. Yeah, it is a rough death. And kind of the decision, not really thinking, Mercury's in fall in Pisces, Mercury in Pisces retrograde, not really thinking, getting out of the carriage to inspect the damage instead of staying in the carriage where it was safe, and then getting his feet blown off and then his abdomen like ripped open. Mars in Cancer. I was like, man, like, Wow, what a rough death. And, the interesting thing on that day, there was also a Venus Neptune conjunction happening on that day. Venus was in Taurus and it was on his sun. And, it's kind of puzzling in a way. But sometimes you see and it's like, well, the Venus Neptune wasn't enough to really keep him to keep him protected, right? And I mean, the thing about the Venus, sometimes with death charts, you can see like a Neptune influence going on. And in some ways, maybe it's like, okay, well, that person has kind of completed their like efforts in this world, and it is time to move on to like another world, And yeah, so I think and as we get older as human beings, I feel like we become more Neptunian anyway. And we become we get into our 80s or 90s, things start becoming very Neptunian. I mean, I haven't been 80 or 90 in this lifetime, but I kind of have a feeling. It's like you're seeing things, you're accepting you're moving on to another world, you're leaving your body behind, you're kind of ascending into the next realm. Yeah, it kind of made sense when I looked at the Neptune on his north node in Taurus. It's kind of like, I'm done spiritually here, I can move on now. So I think that is interesting. I mean, what's fascinating to me too is at the time of his death, he was actually on his way to a meeting to bring what basically was the start of a constitution for a more free society to this committee that was going to start putting together the beginning of what would have been kind of a democracy, and you can see that Jupiter and Aries trudging along, Jupiter and Aries, right? It's trudging along, and then boom, it runs into Saturn. It looks like, wow, this is really going to go somewhere, and, Russia may have democracy. And who knows, if he hadn't been killed and he would have actually been able to arrive and do that, maybe Russia would have had a completely different history, and the thing is that we'll never know. And he's trudging along in his carriage, and boom, he runs into Saturn, and progress, hope, growth, everything is stopped. And it is the start of a new Saturn-Jupiter cycle. And as we know, he was born on a Saturn-Uranus cycle, but his death represents the start of a new Saturn-Jupiter cycle. And when I looked at his sun's chart, his sun doesn't have a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction or a Saturn-Uranus square, but his sun does have a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which, as we know, Russia has a major history with Saturn-Neptune cycles, Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, squares, opposition. Those usually indicate big things for Russia. And you can see that kind of starting with Alexander III, his son. He's got that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And, unfortunately, his son doesn't carry on the more liberal reforms that his father was trying to make, but continues to kind of bring Russia back into darker times. And anyway, you guys, so that is what I am getting. And thank you for listening, and thank you for being here. I appreciate all your comments, and yay for us for digging into Russian history on a Saturday night. We are truly astrology nerds of the universe, and I salute you all. Wishing you all a very wonderful evening. Enjoy your night, and take care, everybody.